You know, I was just talking to a friend of mine. The local court revoked my driver's license while I was in the nursing home for a stroke a few years ago. So this crazy judge calls my case, and of course I wasn't there. I told a relative to get a continuance, but instead he didn't do that. And so when my case was called, because I wasn't there, they revoked my license for failure to appear in court, which is the same thing that pulled on Randy Weaver in the ruckus out in Idaho. Oh, I'm certainly glad to be here. You know, Ezra Pound was the hero of young people during the 1920s, and then they put the Iron Curtain down, and you never heard of him again. Well, I was going to Washington University in Lexington, Virginia, which was founded by George Washington, and Robert E. Lee became the president after the Civil War. I was going to school there. It was a very fine school, but they didn't have an art department. So I moved up to an art school in Washington, D.C., and one of my professors there happened to be visiting Ezra Pound at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And he was a dedicated liberal, but he admired Ezra for his work, and so he was helping him translate French poetry. And he insisted I should go and see Ezra Pound. And I said, what in the world would Ezra Pound talk to me about? And so he took me out there, and we hit it off right away. And I started visiting him every day. I have to tell my audiences that I got my education in the insane asylum, which is really true. I had been to 5 of the best universities in the United States, and I didn't learn one thing. In a week at the St. Elizabeth's Insane Asylum, I heard more common sense than I'd ever heard in all the universities I've been to. They never let him out. I got him freed. I went to a congressman, and he went on the floor of Congress, and he said, why is the government holding this man? He'd been there 13 and a half years without trial, which, as you know, can't happen under our Constitution. It happens all the time. Oh, my gosh. Well, I feel like I've been lucky when I hear about things like that. And Ezra Pound, because I don't think I could have survived one night at St. Elizabeth by 1948, and I got him out in 1958, 10 years later. You see, he had a lawyer in New York named Julian Cornell who was supposed to represent him, and he represented him by never filing a single paper in his behalf. So I sat there for 10 years with him, and I took a friend of mine, a famous newspaper man named Rex Serpent-Lehman. So I introduced Rex to Ezra Pound, and he sat down and talked to him. And finally Rex said, well, you don't belong in here. And Ezra said, well, I don't know that. And he said, well, I'm going to do something about it. And Rex knew all the prominent people in Washington, D.C., so he found this congressman that owed him a favor. He asked him to go on the floor of Congress. So he asked, why is the government holding this man? They had no answer because they never had any case against him whatsoever. Well, usually they do things like that for money. Well, it was kind of strange at first. It was a little frightening because we were surrounded by lunatics. People making faces at you and walking up and down and muttering and so forth. I mean, this is not usual in an educational system, you know. But we talked and we just ignored everybody. And it worked for all the years that I was there. Well, he didn't teach me anything. He said to me, he asked me if I would go to the Library of Congress and see what I could find out about the Federal Reserve System. So I just began researching at the Library of Congress, and I found out it was the greatest criminal syndicate in history, which I state in the foreword of my book. It is. It is not. It's not federal. It has no federal background, and it's not. It has no reserves because it prints its own money. It's a central bank which has the right of issue, the right to print money, and it's not a system. I said it's a criminal syndicate, and you know that book has been circulated for 50 years, and nobody in the Federal Reserve System has ever objected to my calling it a criminal syndicate. If it's not federal, what is it? Well, I've got the greatest and the most flattering thing that can happen to an author. My books have been plagiarized many times. My articles, too. And so that just, it feeds the fire, you know. It keeps the flames going. Well, when Ezra got me into this and I got into it, he said, you've got to write this as a detective story. He realized it was a criminal operation. See, up to that time, he thought of international bankers as conspirators and somewhat criminal, but he thought that the only thing they did was start wars and create famines and revolutions and monetary panics. But he found out it was much more sinister than that. It was a really satanic operation. Well, what I discovered was that the most famous names in this country, the biggest and most important and influential people, like J.P. Morgan, who who always had a man in the White House talking to the president, and these people were running the country, and they were running the world. In fact, when they wrote the Federal Reserve Act at Jekyll Island, Georgia in 1910, during Thanksgiving week, at a secret meeting, the New York Times reported that this group controlled 1/6 of the entire wealth of the world. In fact, they probably control more than that. They probably control it all right now. Oh, it certainly does, because when you have the controlling interest, it's yours. I continued to research, and Ezra helped me. He actually commissioned this book. He paid me $10 a week to do the research on this book, which at that time you could live on in Washington, D.C., believe it or not. Well, $1 in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was passed, was worth 100 cents. Today it's worth 1/6 of a cent. That is inflation. I don't know what is. Well, I put out the Federal Reserve book in 1953, and it's been continuously in print ever since. None of my books have ever gone out of print, but I've got 6 of them. I'm out of stock right now. I got to reprint. After the Federal Reserve, I wrote, and the following year, I wrote the World Order. That was a sequel to the Federal Reserve. It expanded the Federal Reserve to the entire world. And after that, I wrote the Curse of Canaan, which was a study of demonology in history. I found out that demonology has been constant on this earth ever since the beginning of man. And I followed that with the only history of the American Medical Association, which I call Murder by Injection, and which has been a bestseller. One of my biggest fans is Minister Farrakhan, who's trying to educate African-American people that their biggest enemy is their diet. And he's trying to help them in that way, and he's having a lot of success. Well, actually, I didn't find it in research. It was in the daily newspapers. I was living in New York at that time, and you'd pick up the New York Times, and there was a story about a J.P. Morgan partner and his wife having peyote parties at their Greenwich Village mansion. And they were into all sorts of occult drugs. Demonology, when you get into drugs and occult, you get into the demonology. That's part of it. Yes, the occult depends entirely on symbols. And you find this in Renaissance paintings. I have a friend of mine, a very fine artist named Margaret Stuckey, who did my portrait. And she has published a book on the fact that there are occult symbols in all of the famous Renaissance paintings in our museums all over the world. Well, they would do just what they're doing now. They want total control over every person in the world. And if they can't have control of you, they're going to eliminate you. It's that simple. Everything is an end toward the means. Franklin D. Roosevelt said, nothing happens by accident. It's planned that way. Well, they were doomed to failure because Nimrod, who was the first world dictator, collapsed. He was the first, that's in my book on the Curse of Canaan, that this all originated right there where our troops are fighting today in Iraq. That was the cradle of Christian civilization. And in fact, our armies have destroyed many of the earliest Christian artifacts in Iraq all over the country. Well, I think it all goes back to Oriental despotism. I think the despotism, which originated in Asia, always has as its goal mass murder, executions, torture, you name it. That's what they want. Well, human beings no longer become people. They're just articles of commerce. And that's why the 14th Amendment renamed all American citizens as subjects. And we've been known as subjects since the Civil War. And the English were the first to point that out, that there was no revolt against slavery. They just enslaved the whole country. And it's been enslaved ever since. With puppet political parties, we've had no political parties in this country. I have repeatedly written to, here in my home state of Virginia, where Woodrow Wilson was born, a few blocks from where I'm sitting, I have repeatedly notified the governor of Virginia that I want to restore self-government to the state of Virginia. And of course, he's not very happy about that. Well, that's a control mechanism. In fact, vaccines are the biggest boon for the medical profession. When you have a vaccine in your system, that is engineered so you can never, the body can never reject it. It's going to be in there for life. And I quote one doctor who says he never met a person who had cancer who had not been vaccinated. Well, I think that's designated to be in there because that is what creates lifetime illness, that you're going to be at the mercy of doctors as long as you live after you have that vaccination. And the fluoride water, which was an invention of Stalin and Hitler, they discovered they could control their populations in the concentration camps with fewer guards by fluoridating the water supply. Well, fluoride is a byproduct of aluminum manufacture, and it was so poisonous that it was costing them a lot of money to dispose of it. And that was one of the biggest expenses that Aluminum Company of America had, was disposing of the waste from aluminum manufacture. And so they got some doctors to say that this poisonous substance, if it was put in the water, would keep children from having cavities. So it would be a health boon. And so most of the world adopted sodium fluoride. Well, one of my nephews is a very prominent dentist, and he told me he quit using mercury some years ago. A lot of dentists don't use it anymore because they suffer more from it from everybody else. They're grinding teeth, and that mercury vapor as they grind the teeth, they're getting part of that themselves. I know one dentist here in my hometown that's totally cuckoo from mercury vapor. Yeah, well, they work in it all day, you see, and they're the worst victims of it. Well, you see, they never called it mercury for many years. They only called it amalgam. So amalgam sounds all right to you. Why would anybody get scared of that? They wouldn't even mention mercury. Well, they have to control us. It's not that they hate us. They're just using us. I mean, we're human fodder, that's all. Well, some people keep their horses and cows in barns that are more lavishly furnished than a lot of people's homes. They're really rich people. But I was in Washington, D.C. when they fluoridated the water in Washington, D.C., and the senators and congressmen boasted that they would never drink a drop of it. They outfitted every congressional office in Washington, D.C. with mountain bottled water brought in from West Virginia. And the reverse filter is the best one because it really takes the stuff out of there. Osmosis, yes. Well, if you use the Federal Reserve money, which is the only money you can use, it's the medium of exchange, well, you're in their hands. They can do anything they want. Well, do you know that the entire Federal Reserve Act was written, it's been plugged in books on economics ever since as banking reform. They said, we'll never have another panic, we'll never have another depression, and we'll have internal prosperity. And the mission of the Federal Reserve System was to stabilize the dollar. And they've not done nothing but destabilize the dollar ever since they started operation. Well, Greenspan crash caused the crash of 2000, in which the New York Times said that they took $8 trillion from the American people between March and November of 2000. Well, his mentor was Milton Friedman, who also denounced the Federal Reserve, saying they'd never done anything right in their operation. So he became the most august economist in the country. But the only reason they put Greenspan in charge of the Federal Reserve System is that he fully understood it. He published all these things about it, and they found out that he absolutely understood the Federal Reserve System, so he is the ideal person to run it and do anything they wanted. Well, he was known as Mr. Fixer on Capitol Hill. He is the one that upped the Social Security tax and really put the young married couples in this country on the bind because they were paying so much Social Security tax that they couldn't afford to have children or buy a home. Oh, that's been printed many times in Newsweek and Time over the years. Every time we have a national election, somebody in Newsweek or Time points out that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is more powerful than any president. Well, they're talking about a real estate crash, and they're really promoting that. Certainly will. In fact, they're going to buy up New Orleans. You know, Katrina happened to be one of the biggest occasions for urban renewal this country has ever seen. New Orleans was absolutely a mess. I spoke down there in July, and the whole town was decrepit and was falling apart. And with this hurricane, they're going to rebuild it from the ground up, and they bust out. Now, Farrakhan has criticized this, and he's absolutely right. They have bust out the black people from New Orleans, and they're going to rebuild it from the ground up. They're going to make it another Las Vegas. Well, the same inside people, they're going to make all the money because you're going to see fortunes, billions of dollars made in New Orleans after this Katrina thing. And then they're never going to allow the African Americans to come back in there. And they'll make a lot of money, and New Orleans will be a beautiful place in 5 years when they get this thing going. But it's going to cost a lot of money, and people are going to make a lot of money.
Hello there, Alex. Mr. Mullins, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, fellas, I wanted to, you touched on something early, Mr. Mullins, and it's a coincidence because I had this ready to go. I called in earlier not knowing that you were going to be on. I wanted to touch upon a subject, and I want to make Alex, yourself, and your listeners aware of Enki and the World Order, an ancient poem that was of Sumerian in a narrative poem, and it's the New World Order, basically from ancient times, and what it documents. And I don't know if George Orwell, writer of 1984 and things, was aware of this. He may have been, because it describes Enki, or he describes himself as a big brother. So it's like the Christianity never happened. I mean, it's like it was totally ignored, and they haven't stopped doing these sacrifices and things like this. From Bohemian Grove, I just recently obtained a copy of it. I think it's fantastic, and I say more power to you. Well, I just wanted to understand how this can be ignored. I mean, this is not 25 years old. But also, 40 years ago, or in the 40s actually, the Ghosts on the Loose from the East Side Kids, Leo Gorcey movies, we're talking about the New World Order.
No, that's absolutely true. Adolf Hitler's main book after Mein Kampf was the New World Order, and that's exactly what he was working on.
So the 40s and thousands of years ago, it's like it's something that can't be just overlooked and say, oh, someone's making this up today. It's not.
Well, they don't even learn the lessons. That's the problem. It's not a question of forgetting. They just remain unaware of what is really going on right in front of their eyes. Well, that's exactly what he wanted to do all along. After all, his father took the world drug operation and incorporated it into the CIA, and a guy who can run a deal like that, you have to say he has some ability.
I'd just like to talk real quick about the an act that was passed shortly after September 11th that not too many people are aware of, the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, which talks about forced quarantines and vaccinations in the event of a public emergency.
Well, that was all part of the general program for world control. I mean, they hailed 9/11 as another Pearl Harbor. And, of course, Pearl Harbor was one of the funniest things that ever happened. Well, that's exactly what it was planned to do. And it's working fairly well, apparently. And the American people were totally sold on it. And we're in Iraq today because of 9/11. Actually, our troops are over there to avenge 9/11. That's the only reason they're there. Oh, well, you know, you've probably never heard of this, but in the year 2000, Bush addressed the graduating class at West Point, and he boasted that they were going to launch preventive strikes against 69 countries that were supporting terror. Well, I was in a hotel in Tokyo, and I read it in the Asahi Shimbun, and I couldn't believe it, and I thought I would get back here and do a story on it, and when I got back here, I could not find it mentioned in any newspaper. Everything they do is lunacy.
Actually, I called yesterday, and I got a dropped call. I'm a first-time caller. Well, yesterday what I was calling about was when you had JOF on. I went into a local gun shop and bought a AR-15, but it was older, and you know how ATF says if it has any M16 parts in it, even if it doesn't fire, they still consider it a machine gun?
Yes.
So I pulled the parts out, and I went ahead and bought it because I wanted the pre-band lower out of it, and I went back in the gun store 2 days later, and supposedly a cop had dropped off this gun. The owner says, hey, I said, I've never had this happen before. He said, ATF called yesterday, wanted to know who bought that gun. And when I told them that you took all the M16 parts out of it in the store, they just hung up on him.
Well, they certainly do, and they are a criminal operation if you've ever seen one. I mean, they'll do anything. Well, Randy Weaver is a typical example.
Yeah.
But they finally had to wind up, after he murdered his wife and son, they had to finally pay him a measly $3 million for destroying his family. For the FBI's top sniper in the United States to shoot Randy Weaver's wife through the forehead, that takes some doing. Well, apparently that's the American dream, or at least that's the American dream turning into a nightmare. Well, I think the American people are waking up in the nick of time because we're in a desperate situation. And I really believe that the American people will rise to the occasion. After all, the American Revolution took place within 10 miles of where I'm sitting. You know, the American Revolution was not a popular uprising. Only 4% of the colonists took part in the American Revolution. Our history books have always said this was a mass uprising of popular people wanting freedom. And that's total nonsense. There's only 4% of the people that objected to the British at all.